Welcome to Majoring in the Majors with Pastor S.J. Munson on the Artist First Radio Network. All past shows are available in podcast form. You can find them at artistfirst.com. Your host is the author of two books, The Treasure of Israel and Christ Held Hostage, The Hijacking of American Christianity. Ladies and gentlemen, it's Pastor S.J. Munson.
Hi, this is S.J. Munson, and thank you for tuning in to Majoring in the Majors. Since the 2016 election, I think millions and millions of people, not only here in the U.S. but across the world, who are in and outside of the church, have been confused and appalled at what they see as an unholy union, not only between politics and religion, which seems to be a staple of our culture, but also between Christianity and racism and white supremacy. And here to help us understand this phenomenon is Dr. Robert P. Jones, who is founder and CEO of the Public Religion Research Institute, and also the author of White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, published by Simon & Schuster. He writes regularly on politics, culture, and religion for The Atlantic, Online, and NBC Think, and other outlets. He has featured frequently in major national news media, such as CNN and MSNBC, NPR, among others. And he holds a Ph.D. from Emory University and an M.Div. from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. He's also the author of The End of White Christian America, which won the 2019 Grawemeyer Award in Religion. Congratulations on that. And thank you, Dr. Jones, for being on our show.
Well, thanks, S.J. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, and you gave me permission to call you Robbie, so...
Yeah, I'll call you S.J. You can call me Robbie. Yeah, that's right.
Okay, great. So you were, first of all, a fabulous book, as I mentioned to you earlier when we were talking. Really, really impressive book and answered a lot of questions for me. It's chock full of facts and history, and you really did, fine research, and also just a fine writing style as well. So congratulations on that. You were born and raised in the Deep South and brought up in the Southern Baptist Church, and the Southern Baptist Convention, while not the only denomination with such a history, certainly has had a complicated relationship with slavery and Jim Crow and racism and white supremacy. Can you talk about your growing up in this church culture, and when did you start to realize there was something contradictory with biblical Christianity?
Yeah, well, I grew up pretty deep in it, so yeah, as you said, I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi, and Southern Baptist Church that I was in from the age of 7 all the way through college. I have a degree from a Southern Baptist Seminary as well, so very steeped in that Southern Baptist world. And my family is we moved to Jackson when I was 7, but both sides of my family are actually from Middle Georgia, so just down I-20 to in and around Macon, Georgia. In fact, on both sides, my mom and my father's side have our ancestors go back 6 generations, so 200 years in Middle Georgia, and actually in either one of two counties, Twiggs County or Bibb County, Georgia. And I get I didn't really get hardly any of this growing up, and I think that's one of the really astonishing things that writing a book gave me the chance to even think, kind of reflect back on, that I didn't get any of this history, and in particular, because the beginning of the Southern Baptist Convention is actually in 1845 over slavery, and it is the break between the North and the South, so Northern and Southern Baptists, which predate the Civil War, and actually both the Methodists and the Baptists both split in 1845 over the issue of slavery. In many ways, that Christian split was the precursor to the Northern and Southern political split that gives us the Civil War and laid the theological and political foundations for that split. I had no idea that was the legacy and the history until I was really in my early 20s and in seminary. And I finally had a Baptist history class in seminary that really laid it laid it out and said, no, this is the beginning. And in fact, I had never even reflected on what the word Southern really meant in Southern Baptist Convention, other than like geographic South, but that Southern was a euphemism really for slave supporting and later for Confederacy supporting denominations.
And why did you decide to write this book at this particular moment in our nation's history?
Yeah, well, so I think it began percolating in me that I really needed to get a better understanding. This book is personal. I mean, most of the time in my writing, I kind of have on my social scientist hat, which is a hat that I wear at PRRI. We're looking at public opinion data or demographic change data, so kind of social science hat. But I realized for this one, I really needed it to be a more personal book, and I had to kind of weave together my own understanding. And in some ways, it really was my own journey of trying to wrestle with this legacy and what it meant for our kind of history as a country, but also what it meant for me personally and my own faith and kind of my own relationship to Christianity. So in many ways, this book was a journey that was started, probably 5 years ago. It was I was deeply disturbed by the events where Dylan Roof, who was many of your listeners may recall, was the person who walked into Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston and gunned down 9 African Americans who were there at Bible study. I think that jolted me awake a bit. And here's why: because it got reported on, obviously, far and wide, but what did not get reported on very much was his religiosity, and that he was an ELCA Lutheran, right? He was a member of he'd grown up in the church, he'd gone to catechism classes, and he was a member of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, which is a mainline Protestant denomination, and that identity was not separate from his understanding of his desire to murder African Americans in an attempt to start a race war in the country, and that in his journals that he had in prison, he was writing this racist screed about starting a race war, and there was text there, and that's what most of the people in the media focused on. Even the courts focused mostly on the text. But if you look at it was scanned in, and if you look at it's online, you can actually see that all around this text he had doodled these Christian images, crosses, other symbols, and like had full page portraits of like a cross. And the one that really struck me was a very detailed drawing of a white Jesus emerging from the tomb, being resurrected, and that he really saw this as a symbol of white supremacy, and very consistent with his white supremacist identity and his Christian identity really coexisted fairly comfortably for him.
It was certainly a very, very, very disturbing event, and I think a lot of people were rocked by that, hopefully in a positive way. That will lead to change. You talk in your book about the challenge of seeing whiteness, and your book brings out the fact that so often, as white people, we think of white supremacists as like a skinhead or neo-Nazi, someone who belongs to the Proud Boys, who were partially responsible for attacking the Capitol on the 6th of January this year, and so it's easy to dismiss that term, white supremacy, as an extremist view, when actually it is as American as apple pie, unfortunately. It permeates our culture at every single level. Can you help us understand what you're talking about in saying that?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult for many white people or people who think of themselves as white to take this concept seriously in a way that feels close to home. I think you're right that what we tend to do is we hear white supremacy, we will even make it a black and white image in our mind, for example, like a kind of grainy black and white image of somebody in the 1920s in a hood and a robe and burning a cross in someone's yard, something like that, and that by doing that, we're able to just say, okay, look, that's nowhere near me. It's generations ago, and I don't know anyone who's behaving in that way. And so white supremacy is just back there and over there and not in here. And one of the things I try to do in my own writing and my own reflections is try to reflect on how is it much closer to home. And one of the ways, just a kind of mental exercise, is even flipping the words around from white supremacy, which we kind of can do that little trick with, to the supremacy of whites. And what does that mean, and how close is that to us? And I think what you said is American is apple pie. I mean, it has been so widespread since the inception of the country, right? That this country, and particularly when you evoke America, that word, that it is intended to be for the benefit of whites, and that other people are here, whether they're Native Americans or African Americans brought here, in chains, or other more recent immigrants that are not from Europe. That there is a kind of hierarchy, and that the thing that Christianity did to that hierarchy was baptize it and give it Christian legitimation, right? That it married up a kind of human construct, a human hierarchy, and transformed it into a divine plan. So then it was actually even stronger, right? Because it was this idea that America, the New Zion, and all of that language was really wrapped up in the idea that it was, and Manifest Destiny, those ideas were all about a kind of racial hierarchy with white people at the top of that racial hierarchy, Native Americans, African Americans, other people of color somewhere down below there, and that really was the divine plan for the country. And that, even if I think some people, modern sensibilities, would reject that pretty quickly, that idea has been with us all the way up through the second half of the 20th century, through all of American history.
Now, you also talk about the role that Christianity has played in the institution of slavery and lynchings and Jim Crow and the massive resistance to racial equality in this country. Let me just tell you maybe one illustration that you might appreciate. When I tell this story, some people just stare at me blankly or look horrified, but I think you'll understand. I went to the doctor's office, this is a couple of years ago. Actually, it was a year or two after the 2016 election. And like a lot of white Christians, I was still struggling with the outcome of that election, and the fact that such a person could, win the hearts of 81% of the white evangelical population in this country. And so I was talking to, it was my doctor's office, I was talking to the nurse. She was drawing some blood, and we were talking about the election. She seemed to be sympathetic to what I was saying. She was African American, had grown up in the South, lifetime churchgoer, and so I don't think anything surprised her about this election, but it was certainly surprising me. And at one point, as I was sharing, my struggle to wrap my head around this, she sort of just kind of patted my arm reassuringly or sympathetically, and she said, "Honey, when it comes to racism, the church is where the devil sits." And I thought that was one of the most eloquent statements about what we're talking about. I don't know if you have any remarks about that, or just generally about the role that Christianity has played in our difficult history.
Well, I think it's both cultural and institutional, and that comment that you had, I think maybe probably points to both. I was struck, I think, doing this research again at, when we say the words, like, for example, when we say civil rights movement and church, most people will make a pretty quick association with the African American church. That was a hub for organizing around the civil rights movement, supporting the movement for black equality in the country. What very few people make the connection to, or the role that white churches played in the massive resistance among the white population of this country to that very movement, right? So we only think of church on the good side, of the civil rights movement, but we give the white church a pass in many ways on, and not just its silence. I mean, there were very that was the other thing, is that, I think if I had a version of this in my head before I'd really dug into this, it would have been, yes, that white Christian churches they're complicit, and mostly complicit in their silence, something like that. But the more you dig into it, the more you see, no, actually, they played a very active and proactive role in pushing back against the civil rights movement, not least of which was preventing their own sanctuaries from being integrated. There was massive effort spent to keep churches segregated, and one of the kind of folks, some of the historical research I did in Jackson, Mississippi, my hometown, is on the record saying when integration comes to Jackson, it will come through the door of the churches, and that was the reason why they were doubling down to keep segregation. And everything to, like, going to the links, for example, of posting a deacon on the outside of the church steps. In fact, in talking to my own family and doing this research, I found out that my own grandfather had been a deacon at a church in Macon, Georgia, and that one of his roles on a Sunday morning in the early 1960s was to stand basically as a bouncer on the outside steps of the church to make sure that no one who was non-white entered the sanctuary.
Mm-hmm. One of the shocking things about these stories in your book is the fact that racism and white supremacy have endured in this country, not in spite of our so-called Christian culture, but actually because of it. And you call white Christianity a conductor of white supremacy. Can you explain that? How is that possible? How did that come about?
Yeah, I think for many people it may sound shocking, and it's not a sentence I could have written at the front end of this research. I think. I mean, I don't think I would have had the goods to really write that sentence or to be able to come to that conclusion. But it is, again, if you think about this, kind of maybe gets to the cultural piece here. That in every society. There is one of the roles of religion in every society is to legitimize the status quo, right, or trouble the status quo. So to kind of give it a moral and even divine backing, right, so that the worlds we're living in make sense. They have a kind of moral order to them, and that they're at the deepest level they're connected or are seen to be consistent with what, like, a divine being who created everything, desires in human society, and that's really the role that Christianity played. So, if you look at our history, we don't get slavery without massive numbers of white Christians legitimizing it and pronouncing it consistent with the gospel and consistent with what God wants to see in human society. We got exactly that, in the forming of the Southern Baptist Convention, for example. I mean, just very explicit about that being God's will, and even with things like once the question of slavery is settled, the disenfranchisement of African Americans following Reconstruction, again a period that I think most whites learn almost nothing about, but this kind of clawing back rights. And voting rights, civil rights, from African Americans from like 1870 to 1950, like that whole period was supported by white Christian churches and white Christians, are kind of saying, yes, this is the kind of world, this Jim Crow division with separate restrooms and separate neighborhoods, and all of that is divinely ordained, and all of that, comes. The power that it really gets is from Christianity as the dominant. If we had been, in India or some other, place where Christianity was not the dominant religion, it may have been another religion. But in our context, in America, the religion that played this role in legitimizing that order was white Christianity.
Right. I think that part of the problem is that we tend to think of Christianity with a capital C, which really doesn't exist in the wild, right? It's always manifested through culture, right? It's manifested through culture. We had Roman Christianity in the first through the third centuries, then Byzantine Christianity, and then Christianity spread through other, places, other cultures. And it's always expressed through culture, and our culture being a white colonial racist culture, our Christianity certainly, not just became tinged with it, but permeated with this. And so that Christianity became not only something that justified, but actually helped spread this culture of white supremacy. Now, one thing you point out is the white supremacy we're talking about is not confined to the South, but also also in the North, and not just among Southern Baptists, but also other mainline denominations and even Catholics. Can you talk about that part of the book?
Yeah, I think even for me, who I look at this data on my day job every day, and I think that finding was the strength of that finding. I think was one of the more surprising things to me too, and it's exactly right that. So one of the things I do in the book is, in addition to a lot of history that we've been talking about, I try to quantify like how these views are still with us today using contemporary public opinion data. Kind of looking at a number of questions around systemic racism and racist attitudes, and I use a 15-question scale and then kind of combine this into one composite measure that I call the racism index, and that you can then use to kind of compare different groups. And I scored it 0 to 10, with like 10 being holding the most racist attitudes, 0 being holding the least racist attitudes. And it, again, may not come as a great surprise that when I crunch the numbers that white evangelicals, right, the group that's most heavily anchored in the South, scored 8 out of 10 on that scale. Again, with 10 being kind of holding the most racist attitudes across all these questions. But what's more surprising to find out is that the white mainline Protestant group, and that's often thought of as the more liberal end of the Protestant world, where it's United Methodists, Episcopalians, Presbyterians, United Church of Christ, etc., and the northern half of the white Baptists, the American Baptist churches in the USA. But that group scored 7 out of 10. And then also white Catholics, which is the other kind of big kind of tripart group of white Christians in the country, white Catholics who have their own history of discrimination in this country, they also scored 7 out of 10. And if you compare that to, and that was one thing that I was up to in the book, is trying to figure out, well, what work is Christianity doing among white Americans on this issue of racial attitudes? So I compared those Christian groups to whites who were religiously unaffiliated, that is, who claimed no religious affiliation at all. And lo and behold, they only scored 4 out of 10 on the same scale. So essentially what I found is that, yes, it's not just white evangelicals, it's not just white Christians in the South, but it is white mainline Protestants who are more dominant really in the kind of Midwest, and it's white Catholics who are more dominant in urban centers and in the Northeast. These attitudes are prevalent really across the board, and they differ a lot from the attitudes of whites who are not Christian. So essentially it boils down to what the data shows is that if you take your average white American and you add Christian identity, they move up the scale in terms of holding more racist attitudes.
It's so ironic in a tragic way, because I can't think of many things that are so antithetical to the teachings of Christ than white supremacy and racism. Now, you say that the fact that white churches do so much good to those who are inside them, or even in the world, that it's difficult for Christians to imagine how much harm they have done to those outside of the church, outside of the white church. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I would say, as a white male growing up in the 70s and 80s, I would say that gosh, like 95% of my experience with church was positive. It was just overwhelmingly a positive force in my life. I felt community support. I felt, like it gave me, like I learned parliamentary procedure, right, at church for running committee meetings, like those kinds of things. And sang in the choir, was part of a youth group. It was just socially a very supportive place. And yet, the words of Martin Luther King Jr., which I, of course, had not read at that point, didn't read too much later in my life, but I remember when I first read Letter from Birmingham Jail, the piece that stood out to me the most was his indictment of, these self-congratulatory white Christian churches that see themselves as doing all this good in the world, see themselves as pillars of the community, salts of the earth, etc., but they are really wholly unconcerned with the good of people outside their walls, or at least outside their racial group. And he had this really searing line that I remember from the first time I read it, where he said, he's like in writing about Birmingham, and he's writing to the moderate. It's kind of worth noting, he's writing that letter to the moderate Christian and Jewish leaders in Birmingham, who are not the overt racists. They're just mostly sitting on the sidelines. And he has this phrase where he says, like, who are these people sitting behind the safety of their anesthetizing stained glass windows? And this sense that, one of the roles that the church has played is a kind of dulling of white Americans' consciousness when it comes to racial justice work, a kind of heightened sense of individual sin, and a dulling of our ability to even see systemic racism, or to see racial injustice as something that impinges upon us, and even hiding really the truth about ourselves from ourselves. It's really hard. It's the first chapter of the book I called Seeing, for that reason, that I think it is one of the hardest things for people like me, who grew up with a very positive experience of being in a white Christian church. It's hard. It's hard to kind of turn the lens around and say, okay, well, all that is true, and what else is true, right? To make room for example, to be kind of angry, like on my part. Like I became kind of angry that my pastors and my Sunday school teachers had lied to me, really, is the only way to put it, right? That they hadn't told me the truth about our own history and given me an opportunity to really know who I was as a result of that history. And something I'm having to kind of reconstruct for myself as an adult is, troubling.
Yeah. My wife and I have been struggling over the past several years to find a church that we feel comfortable in because of these issues. We have a daughter who's biracial, and we went into one church we visited, and I met one of the assistant pastors, and he welcomed me, very friendly guy. And I don't know how we got to talking about it, because I usually don't I don't lead with that, but I said something about, that I'm very concerned about, issues of racism and social justice. He said, "Oh, you're one of those social justice Christians." And he says, "Yeah, we have a few people in the church who feel the way you do." And I felt like, are we reading the same? Maybe it's a different translation of the Bible, but I read what God says about Himself. He's a God of justice. It's on almost every page. It's in the prophets, it's in the Psalms. And how did that become an option? That you could check when you're becoming a Christian. You talk about how white Christianity leads to a kind of social apathy. Can you kind of trace how that came about?
Yeah, well, it came about very deliberately and by design, I think is really the thing to say. So if you ask yourself, like, what do you have to do to a religion or to Christianity specifically? What do you have to do to the faith to have a functional religion for those who are white that blinds them to what they're doing to people of color? And it means that you have to construct your theology a very particular and very careful and particular way, so that it doesn't blow up these assumptions about white racial hierarchies and white supremacy. And really, that's what we've inherited. We just inherited a religion that has been crafted by design to not raise these issues, because it needed to coexist in a white supremacist society. It needed to coexist at first among where we were actually owning other human beings, and it had to exist in a way that that now, and I'll go back to something you said, right? This thing about Jesus, it is something contradicting the teachings of Jesus. But we should be really clear that for white Christian churches in the South and for millions of white Christians, there was no conflict between owning another human being based on the color of their skin and faith in Jesus. There was no conflict between slavery and the gospel. These things were seen to be compatible. In fact, they were read in such a way, they were kind of read and developed in such a way that the theology demanded that social order, right? It was like that was the ideal social order. If you go back and you read, the prayers or the sermons that were preached around the Confederacy by many Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterian ministers, I mean, this is what you hear. That this is actually what, not just some kind of thing we're holding our noses and kind of looking past, as maybe a non-ideal situation, but something that's actually kind of divinely mandated as an ideal for human society, and that theology is good for white people and good for black people, even as slaves. Like that's how strong that was, and that was the message of Jesus. Like, we really have to be able to say that to understand kind of where we are. And so even today, the kind of hyper-individualism that really reduces salvation and reduces sin really to something that happens, internally, or that you do just individually. It's individual sin, it's individual salvation, but it doesn't give you any theological or conceptual tools for thinking about the ways that human beings build institutions to perpetuate these inequalities. I think this is one of the biggest fights that we have in front of us. And exactly what you said is, that one of those social justice Christians is exactly putting its finger on, no, we're the individualists over here who aren't going to think about those social justice questions, and even kind of cast a side-eye glance of suspicion towards something like social justice.
Mm-hmm. You also do a great job of tracing the shift. There was a shift in the church in the 19th century. I guess it was before the Civil War. The evangelical white churches were largely premillennialist, and afterwards they were postmillennialist, and how that led to this sort of dulling of the church's vision to human suffering and social ills. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm just going to hope you've got a lot of theology geeks among your listeners to kind of get into the premillennial, postmillennial. Yeah.
But maybe you want to just define what the terms mean. Just
briefly,
so
if even if you don't want to get into the terms, I mean, it basically just is a question of what the responsibility of human beings are on this earth, right? And one view has it that part of our goal is to kind of help it's a kind of more optimistic view of progress, that on here and now, that we're going to kind of build the kingdom of God on earth, and that part of the job of a faithful Christian is to kind of put your shoulder to the wheel and do your part for that. There's another view, the sort of one that comes on after the Civil War, that is like, no, that's all wrong. The world's actually on a downward trajectory, not an upward trajectory, and that's just about what happens in a sinful world, And the only thing that's going to make that right is not any human effort, but ultimately it's just going to keep going downward until we get the second coming of Christ, and then all things will be set right. But it really comes down to what is the human responsibility in the world, and in terms of how we live out Christianity. And prior to the Civil War, we did have this sense among most evangelicals that in fact they saw the Confederacy as an expression of this upward trajectory of a kind of idealized human society. But then with the rift of the war and the loss in the war, it created a great theological crisis because that view became no longer tenable with the loss in the Civil War. And so the theological response was really this shift to say, oh, no, actually our responsibility is not then to kind of build the ideal human society or the kingdom of God here on earth. That's going to be God's job later, and it's just not going to get better. In fact, it's going to get worse before it gets better. And so then I think that gives, what that does, it allows particularly white Christians to step back and really be less concerned about kind of building out that kingdom, and a whole this kind of individualist theology can really take hold then. That really is about individual sin, individual salvation, that's really disconnected from the work of social justice in the world.
I really appreciate your making the connection between that shift, theological shift, and the Civil War. I was always aware of that shift historically, but I never made that connection. That it makes a lot of sense that in the South, particularly having lost the Civil War, and developing that lost cause type of mentality, you would have to change your theology to, include something that, well, this is not an ideal world that we're living in, and, we just have to put up with it until Jesus comes back, So that was really helpful and interesting. You talk about how the role that racial attitudes play in structuring white Christian identity. Can you sort of unpack that term for us?
I'm trying to think about exactly where. Can you say just a little bit more about what you're thinking about there?
Yeah, well, the role that racial attitudes play in structuring white Christian identity, how Christians view themselves. In other words, how they've structured their identity based around this racism.
Yeah. I read about this a little bit at the beginning of the book, and I'm borrowing here from, to be clear, from Toni Morrison, who, interesting, was like writing really about, the field of literature, and how African American perspectives and presence really is often ignored in white writers' writing. So just because a white author doesn't talk about or mention African American characters doesn't mean that they're not shaped by it. And I think that's really the key insight here that I kind of applied to theology in churches, and that is that I think we have this sense that well, even in seminary, it gets presented this way, or in a religion class, it often gets presented as if there's this lineage of white Christian theologians, right? And so we'll read Barth, or we'll read Kierkegaard, or we'll read, like this kind of white European authors, and they're read in kind of a tunnel that is as if they're only talking to each other, right? And they're decontextualized, dehistoricized. But just as with that example we just talked about this shift, and thinking about the end times, that all of these things are socially embedded. They develop in response to social problems on the ground, and that even when white theologians aren't writing about their relationship to African Americans or other people of color or Native Americans, it's nonetheless being shaped by it, and so even if we just take another quick example, that as white settlers are moving, like my family, for example, arrives in Georgia in the early 1800s, and the way we get there is that we are awarded land from a land lottery. Now that sounds like, oh, the government is handing out land, but where did that land come from? It came from the forcible removal of Native American tribes from that area, and so we moved down there, and there's this whole development. But even the idea, right, of manifest destiny, of America as the promised land, all of that stuff only makes sense in this broader context of white supremacy, and in relationship to thinking about how we think about ourselves relative to African Americans, how we think of ourselves relative to Native Americans, even if we're not consciously thinking about that.
Now, you talk a little bit about white supremacy and Christianity in regard to an issue that's come up in the past few years, particularly in the headlines about Confederate monuments.
Mm-hmm.
What is the relationship between Christianity and that issue?
Yeah, the monuments thing, I think, has got a lot of the monuments issue has a lot of confusion around it. I think the history can really help us here. Until I really started digging into it, I think I wasn't as clear either that, most of these monuments to the Confederacy that dot the landscape, and there's more than 1,700 of them across mostly the South. But certainly if you grew up in the South, you can't go in pretty much any town of any size without seeing some marker there. They were largely put there, actually not after the Civil War or during the Civil War, but there's a big spike of monument building really between 1900 and 1930. And the reason for that really is that this is also when there is a great movement to disenfranchise and to kind of African Americans from voting, to really harden up Jim Crow laws and to kind of keep a society very segregated. And so as those laws are being enacted, these monuments are also getting put up as really testimony and totems to white supremacy in the country. And one group in particular I learned a lot about actually doing the research of the book is the United Daughters of the Confederacy. It was a huge women's group, over 100,000 strong, and they're responsible for the vast majority of these big monuments, and they were raising, in today's terms, millions of dollars to put these monuments up, and these were also the kind of upper echelon women of the community, which meant that they were also heavily involved in the country's churches. And in fact, for example, when they set up a big monument in Richmond to Jefferson Davis in the early 1900s, it was a whole weekend long set of events, and one of the main places they had a breakout space and meeting spaces, Second Baptist Church in Richmond, was the place that gave them the space to hold many of their events and their meetings while they were having this multi-day celebration. And they actually broke Sunday morning so that everyone who was attending the dedication of this memorial could all go to church, and then they kind of reconvened afterwards. So it again just kind of shot through with imagery, and even on that statue, it has at the top of a nearly 5-story pedestal, a gold statue of a woman with her finger pointed toward the heavens, and the words "God will vindicate," in Latin, are right under this statue. So even the explicit labeling of the statues made kind of Christian appeals.
Right. Another thing I appreciate about the book too is in the midst of all this bad news, you sort of end with a couple chapters talking about the evidence that change is actually occurring, and proposing some ways that we can approach the problem and start to eradicate it. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I did try to kind of look at the end and try to see if I could peer around the corner a bit and look for some hopeful signs. And I talked, for example, about 2 Baptist churches in Macon, Georgia, again, kind of connected to my own family's story, So there's certainly other places like this in the country, but these were two churches that one predominantly white, one predominantly black, that shared a history that went back in the early 1800s. In fact, they used to be the same church. They still both go by First Baptist Church in Macon, and they had, same fraught relationship. They began as one church with white slave owners bringing enslaved people to church with them, white sitting in the front, African Americans sitting in the back, and then eventually split into two churches, but under the supervision of the white church. And then once they got fully independent after the Civil War, they largely ignored each other despite being just around the corner from each other in a relatively, modestly sized town. And it wasn't until 2014 that they had two pastors that decided, we should really work to kind of rebuild community between the two. And they're not going to merge the church. That's not really what they're up to, but they are about rebuilding some sense of community and getting to know one another. And that's actually quite a beautiful story, and it continues. I was just actually with them the other day on Zoom to kind of check in on how they're doing. And, it's not linear progress by any means, but I think it's been life-changing, just that they've set out to, and again, it's not rocket science really, but just setting out to do things like potlucks, Easter egg rolls for the kids, joint youth trips, service projects, like that kind of thing, just so the two congregations can get to know each other. And it's led to kind of I think a real accountability, particularly for the white church, of kind of trying to think about their history more honestly, and in a way that I think is bringing them to a more healthy place for the future.
Now, often we hear white churches talking about, reconciliation. There needs to be racial reconciliation. You make the point in your book that we need to aim for something more than racial reconciliation. We need to aim for something called racial justice. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, I think I actually learned this myself from watching these two churches work together and from hearing what the white church in particular had learned from the experience. And this was one of the outcomes, is that the pastor of the church, Scott Dickinson, from the predominantly white church, said, look, we just learned that reconciliation is really, it is the goal. Ultimately, it's the end result that we want. But we've kind of figured out that we can't really aim for it directly. In other words, like we really, he says, so we've stopped talking about reconciliation. We talk about justice and repair. And the idea is that, well, yes, of course, we would all love for there to be racial reconciliation, but there are justice issues there. There are wrongs that need to be righted. There are confessions that need to be made. And that work is always on the front side of anything like reconciliation. And so, the thing I kind of learned from there and kind of have written is that, I am kind of urging white Christians not to make reconciliation the frame, because I think the temptation there is that's the good stuff. We want to get to the good, warm and fuzzy stuff, and we want to skip the hard work if you're white. But that's never going to be authentic, right? To really authentically get there, I often say, we want to meet on the peak, the kind of peak on the other side of reconciliation, but we first got to walk through the valley of justice and repair to get over to that other peak there. And if we do enough work, if we're white and Christian, if we do enough work of repair and do enough work of compassion, do enough work of justice, the reconciliation part is really going to take care of itself.
Now, we've been talking to Dr. Robert P. Jones, who's founder and CEO of the Public Religion Research Institute and the author of White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. Robbie, your book is available on, I'm assuming, on most online book retailers as well as bookstores. Anything else you want to say about that?
No, that's right. Wherever books are sold. I guess the last comment I'll make is I'm going to quote James Baldwin, who I also learned a lot for working the book, is that I am actually quite hopeful at this point. Even finished the book in 2019, came out in 2020, and even with some hindsight, I'm more hopeful than I may have anticipated I would be. And I'll quote him on my way out here. He said, if we have the courage and love to kind of face the current challenges in front of us, and he wrote this 50 years ago. Here are his words. He said, "We can end the racial nightmare. We can achieve our country, and we can change the history of the world."
Yeah, those are inspiring words. Dr. Robert P. Jones, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and to talk about your book. A wonderful book. I highly recommend it to all who are listening. Please get a hold of it if you can and read it. It's very eye-opening and a very important book, I think, as our country struggles to come to grips with our history of white supremacy and how we can dismantle it. Thank you again, and thank you all for listening. This is Pastor S.J. Munson wishing you a good evening.